Good evening. My name is Ellis Simon, and I'm going to recreate a presentation I did on Thursday, February 11th, to the Oyster Bay Railroad Museum on moving freight on the Long Island Railroad. Going to get my presentation up via share screen in a few moments, so please bear with me. This is about moving freight on the Long Island Railroad. These are the topics I'm going to talk about. So everybody knows that the Long Island Railroad is one of the biggest passenger carriers in the world. It's the biggest by far in the United States. The one time it had a very substantial freight business. Fortunately, it was dwarfed by the passenger business. However, that freight business was vital to the economic development of Long Island, particularly during the suburban housing boom after World War II. And it also served several industries throughout Brooklyn and Queens and New York City. The Long Island Railroad had some challenges with serving the freight customers. They had a very difficult operating environment. They didn't have long haul traffic. Most of the business was inbound, which meant that there were very few cars that they originated, and they had to ship back a lot of empties. Also, since the business was concentrated in New York City, the distances that they carried the freight were very short. Since they were on an island, they had to rely on car floats to interchange with the other railroads in the New York area. And because the railroad was so busy with passenger trains, they had to keep the freight trains out of their way. Long Island Railroad started in Brooklyn in 1834. By 10 years later, they had completed their main line out to Greenport, which is a little over 90 miles away. But in 1857, Brooklyn decided to ban steam engines. So the Long Island Railroad started to plan a new line to the East River. And 1859, they started to work on that. That line today is their main line to Penn Station. And when they completed that line, they suspended service to Brooklyn. They weren't the only game in the railroad business in the mid 19th century. In 1852, they had a company called the Flushing Railroad that built a line from Flushing to the East River. They followed Newton Creek as far as Penny Bridge, and then they turned north to go to Flushing. Fortunately, they went bankrupt in a few years. They reorganized themselves, calling themselves the New York and Flushing. And after a few more years, the Long Island Railroad acquired it, turned around and sold it to another company, the Flushing and North Side, which was building its own line to the Long Island City waterfront. And after that was complete, the old New York and Flushing line became redundant. It's a third entity in the area, the South Side. They were going to build from the East River to Patchogue, about 50 miles out from New York City. They wanted to use trackage rights over the Long Island between the river and Jamaica, but the Long Island said nothing doing. So they built their own line that went to Bushwick and Williamsburg. Unfortunately, they had to use horses to move the trains between Bushwick and Williamsburg, and that was very inefficient and slow. So after they completed that line to Williamsburg, they started to build another line to Long Island City. And they did that by acquiring the remnant of the New York and Flushing between Laurel Hill and Long Island City, and building a connecting line from Fresh Pond down to Laurel Hill. That line is now the part of the lower Montauk line. The Bushwick branch is still in, and it's still to this day used for freight. So by 1873, there were 3 railroads and 3 terminals in Long Island City. However, by 1884, they had all merged into the Long Island Railroad, which was consolidating terminals. They had a passenger terminal on the south side and the freight terminal on the north side. As you can see from this map, uh, Long Island, being an island, is separated from the mainland and from the railroads that were operating there. They could interchange with 11 different railroads in the New York market, but they had to have a way of getting there. So they depended on car floats. They didn't have a physical connection until 1917 when the Hellgate Bridge opened. And since the freight traffic was overwhelmingly inbound, they had a lot of empties to ship back. Car floats operated mainly out of Long Island City. There were two gantries there. Between them, there were 4 float bridges, and they can handle 4 car floats at any time. The floats could hold 15 to 18 cars, and a tugboat, if they pushed 2 of them in tandem, could take 30 to 36 cars, which was not much less than the length of typical freight train in the early 20th century. Once the floats were tied up to the float bridges, a switch engine would move a spacer car up a float apron and pull the freight cars off the car float and bring them down to A yard, which was a big classification yard in the area. It was hazardous work. If the car floats became unbalanced, freight cars would wind up going into the river. And sometimes the car floats would break away from the dock or from the tow, and they would drift downstream. You also have situations like in the lower right-hand corner where a switch engine collapsed, caused a float apron to collapse. That float apron was the movable part that connected the land to the car float. It was raised or lowered depending on the tide. There were also car floats in Bay Ridge, the southern end of Brooklyn. They were accessed by an old branch of the New York Manhattan Beach Railroad, which was mainly built for taking people to the beach for day holidays. And there was similar size operation in terms of how many barges they can handle, but the yard was more efficient, so they can handle 1,000 cars a day there. The yard and the Bay Ridge float bridges were used mainly by the New Haven Railroad, which acquired trackage rights over the Long Island's Bay Ridge branch in 1917 when the Hellgate Bridge opened. The Long Island Railroad was there mainly to provide switching and local freight service. 1917, the Long Island also got its first on-land connection when the New York Connecting, the entity that built the Hellgate Bridge and the connecting tracks, completed a line to Fremont Junction where they went on to the Long Island Railroad Bay Ridge branch. And at Fremont, there was also a connecting line from the Fresh Pond Yard, the Long Island, and which you can see in the lower right-hand picture. I'll blow it up so you can get a better idea. You can see the tracks cutting off, and the switch engine will take the cars back to Fresh Pond. 1969, the New Haven became part of the Penn Central Railroad, and Penn Central downgraded the Bay Ridge line. They didn't need the car floats anymore. They removed the catenary, the overhead wires to power the electric locomotives, but they still ran down to Fresh Pond, only now the cars were routed via Selkirk Yard up near Albany, which meant that there could be like a 300-mile detour to get the cars to the Long Island Railroad. Fremont and Fresh Pond is still the primary interchange, only now it's for the New York and Atlantic. They connect there with the CSX and Providence and Worcester railroads. There were several yards in Brooklyn and Queens, major yards you see on the left, and secondary yards and terminals as well on the right. I'm going to do the principal yards first. First one you come to is Art Street. It was a classification yard for westbound movements, which meant cars that were going to go onto the car floats to go to the different railroads. There were 21 tracks there, but they were short since they only needed to accommodate enough cars for a single car float. There was team tracks and an LCL freight station in the area. The yard closed in the 1980s and was later used to store rock salt for the New York City snow removal operations. And now the Art Street car shops are on the location. And here you can see what the yard looked like in the 1960s, the salt piles, and what was left of the yard after the tracks were taken up. The big yard in the area was A Yard. It's the principal location for making up freight trains to different places in Brooklyn and Queens. It extended from Thompson Avenue out to the last siding on the far end, which was the Johnson's Wax Warehouse. And it was right next to Sunnyside Yard, the big passenger yard that the Pennsylvania Railroad opened in 1910 when they built Penn Station. And on the north side of A Yard, there were several private sidings that the Long Island Railroad serviced, including MetLife's printing plant, National Casket, and Ronzoni Pasta, my favorite. Here you can see Sunnyside in relation to the A Yard being up here, and you can see how much bigger the Sunnyside Yard was. The Long Island Railroad was to the left of everything, and if you go by, you can look out the window and see what's happening in Sunnyside. A Yard made up a lot of different assignments, switching drills, which were cuts of cars for the local industries. Local freights would go further out into Brooklyn and Queens. They'd have a full crew with a caboose on them. And hauler trains, which moved freight between A Yard and Holborn Yard, which is east of Jamaica. There, cars would be reclassified. Anything that was going east of J Tower in Jamaica would be classified a second time at Holborn Yard. And these trains ran several times a day in each direction. Up here, you can see one of the haulers. Here's an overview of A Yard in the 1970s, the hump they used in classification, and a map of the classification ball. When Sunnyside Yard was built, the Long Island Railroad could no longer connect from A Yard to its main line. So they needed a different way to go. They built a short line called the Montauk Cutoff, which runs from 8 Yard to the lower Montauk line in Blissville. And if you look up at this picture here on the left, you could see the cutoff coming from A Yard, curving off to the left to go over to Blissville. It would pass over the main line tracks just east of the East River Tunnel portals. And the unique thing about this is that trains had to be made up in the opposite direction of their destination. So a train may be going east, but first it would have to head west to go across the Montauk Cutoff. The cutoff also provided access to Degnam Terminal, which is a major industrial area in Long Island City, and was used to reverse passenger locomotives on trains that were stored during the day at Long Island City. At Fresh Pond Yard, which was connected to Fremont, the railroad classified freight that came from the New Haven, as well as freight that came up from the car floats in Bay Ridge. There were 2 sections to the yard. To the left, you see the west yard, which took care of traffic for the Bushwick branch and also for some of the freight going west on the lower Montauk. And the east yard would classify traffic heading, the trains heading in the other direction. It's still used. It's the principal yard and headquarters of the New York and Atlantic today, and where they interchange with the other railroads that come into the area. As said before, the CSX, Providence Worcester, and for a while, Canadian Pacific was coming down there too. There's some of the action at Fresh Pond. Conrail freight on the bridge over the Long Island Railroad. One of the hauler trains going under the bridge. It's the New York connecting line up here. A cut of cars coming back from Fremont Junction into Fresh Pond, and one of the newly painted New York and Atlantic locomotives right after the Long Island Railroad sold them to the New York and Atlantic. Down in Bay Ridge, the New Haven freight trains were terminated and originated. They came in on over the Long Island Railroad with trackage rights. They would transfer there to the car floats. The yard there could handle 1,000 cars a day. The line from Fremont and from Hellgate was electrified in 1927, but in 1959, the New Haven decided not to use the overhead wires, the catenary, so it was de-energized. They did a 180 a few years later when they were able to acquire some used electric freight locomotives at a very good price, so they turned the juice on. And that lasted until Penn Central came in, and Penn Central got rid of Bay Ridge, the float bridges, and the catenary. And the yard has since been rebuilt by the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and there are now 2 new float bridges down there. There's 2 pictures at the top. I'll give you an overview of what it looked like. Well, first, when it opened in the 1920s, there's quite a lot of tracks in here. And then after Penn Central had their fill of it, you could see just one section of tracks over on the far right. Here's the view from the opposite direction. On the left, it's a shot taken in the 1960s. There's a Long Island switch engine, New Haven electric locomotives over here. And this is pretty much the same view in the modern era. I don't know what year this photo was taken, but this is what the yard looks like today. And we go out to Holborn Yard, which was the largest freight yard the Long Island had. It made up trains that go to Nassau and Suffolk, as well as Eastern Queens. It was located between the main line and the Babylon branch of the railroad, and it got the name from a combination of the 2 towns that surrounded it, Hollis and St. Albans. And it was arranged that there were receiving tracks and departing tracks parallel to the main line, but the classification yard was pretty much at a perpendicular to the main line. It was fairly big, had about 26 yards in its peak. It's no longer used for freight. Now it's used for maintenance of way. And the Hillside Maintenance Center, which is the big shop for taking care of the electric multiple unit cars, is located there now. Okay. This is the view from the overpass of the Babylon line looking out toward the receiving yard. Here's a shot from the other end of taken on the Babylon line, the back end of the classification yard. Now we get to the secondary terminals. First, Degnan Terminal in Long Island City. It was an industrial park from the early 20th century that, when it started, had its own switching railroad. Then in 1928, the Long Island Railroad acquired it. It was still fairly active until modern times. In 1966, there were 29 customers there, according to this map. And it remained in service into the 1980s, when finally the switch off the Montauk cutoff was removed. Just got to watch the cursor. Many of the buildings that Degnan served in the Degnan area had indoor sidings. Cars would be pushed into them. Some of them also had elevators that would take the freight cars up to the upper level floors, and they would be unloaded there. Blissville Yard is located alongside the Newton Creek, just east of the Dutch Kills Swing Bridge and before Greenpoint Avenue. At the east end of the yard, that Montauk cutoff came in and joined the lower Montauk line there. It didn't actually go into the yard, but ran alongside it. Blissville was used mainly to serve cars going to Phelps Dodge, Van Eiderstein, and some of the other customers in the area. They had a switcher assigned to the location, and it was drill the cars for Phelps Dodge. In 2008, the New York Atlantic Railroad rebuilt it. In doing so, enabled them to discontinue use of a yard on the other side of the Montauk cutoff. Phelps Dodge was the biggest freight customer the Long Island Railroad had. It was a copper refinery that was started in 1905, became part of the Phelps Dodge Company in 1930. There were 3 sidings on the property. They could have 25 freight cars there at any time. I'll just real quick, I want to show you the larger picture so you can get a better handle on how large the complex was. You can see the Kosciuszko Bridge up in the top of the picture, and also an ocean-going freighter here on Newton Creek, which I didn't know you had the ships that large running. So that was give you an idea of the kind of commerce that was going on in this area. Now, every day, the Laurel Hill switch job would take the cars that were stored at Bliss, bring them over to Phelps Dodge, switch the plant, bring back any cars that were going back to the mainland. The yard, Phelps closed in 1983, and the buildings were subsequently demolished. I think there are a few industries that have cropped up on the location since. Not too far away was the Maspeth Yard. There were 32 private sidings in the area, including Continental Can and A&P, and also 5 team tracks. Team tracks, I should mention, are where first horse-drawn carts, later trucks, would come to load or unload freight from boxcars and other kinds of freight cars. That's how they got their name. Today, they're known as transload facilities. And Maspeth was busy enough to require a 6-yard track, 6-track yard where freight cars would be switched and sorted so they could be taken to the different industries in that location. Atlas Terminal is another private industrial park. It's located in Middle Village. It was east of the Fresh Pond Yard. It was named for Charles Atlas, the famous bodybuilder who was a Middle Village restaurant. And they had their own little industrial locomotive, which you can see down in the lower right of this photo. It was a busy operation. They could handle up to 60 cars a day. They had some A-list tenants there: General Electric, Kraft, Westinghouse, New York Telephone. And that service ended in 1982. The property has since been converted into a retail outlet called the Shops at Atlas Park. It's a very nice outdoor shopping mall. In East New York, you had the New Lots yard. It's very big, over 400 cars it could classify. It was the biggest yard between Fresh Pond and Bay Ridge, and it served 17 customer sidings in the area. Biggest one was the Brooklyn Terminal Market. They also did a lot of business for Sears Roebuck. The yard's no longer with part of the operation. The property is now part of the New York Transit Authority, and they use it to store maintenance equipment. There we go. Bushwick Branch. Short, but very densely industrial line. It was, as I mentioned, it was part of the South Shore line to the East River. One time there were 92 private sidings on there, 2 yards with team tracks. As recently as 1977, there were still 77 sidings in service, and also did a sizable business handling livestock movements. Many of them would go to kosher slaughterhouses in the area. As you probably know, at one time, New York City had the largest concentration of Jews in the world. Bohax had the supermarket chain had a big complex down there. National Can and Steel and Tube also had some sizable operations in the area. Let me go back because I want to show you that far. I just want to blow this up so you can see how much action there was on this short line. Started here coming off the Lower Montauk, and there was hardly space where there wasn't a siding. If you've read The Great Gatsby, if you've seen the movie, you're probably familiar with the Valley of the Ashes. Corona Meadows is where the Valley of the Ashes was. It was located alongside Flushing Creek, between downtown Flushing and where Citi Field is now located. It opened in the 1920s. There were team tracks there and a small storage yard. Took care of customers that had private sidings along the Port Washington branch. And also, it was important to helping the railroad in service on its unprofitable line to Whitestone. Long Island got its customers to use the team tracks instead. The yard stayed open to sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. I'm not sure of the actual year, but in its last years, it was used a lot to scrap Long Island Railroad rolling stock, passenger cars, including many of the parlor cars that used to run out to the Hamptons. In Jamaica, in addition to the yards and corporate headquarters and the shops, you had a lot of freight customers. The freight activity was clustered around the Holborn Yard or just west of the Morris Park shops, which were the 19th century shops for the locomotives and cars that the Long Island had built. The biggest customer in the area was Ideal Toy. Hang on. Go out to Nassau and Suffolk County. The yards were smaller. Primary role was car storage and team tracks rather than classification. Trains were less frequent. They were also, many of them were shorter. And if you go out to the different towns, there were team tracks all over the place. And many stations had coal yards and lumber yards. So they would deliver these cargoes to the different towns. Oops. Some of the bigger locations along the line included New Hyde Park, Mineola, where there was a freight yard on an old branch line that went down to Hempstead, as well as a dozen customers between Main Street and the Meadowbrook Parkway. Now most of those are part of shopping malls. Another big concentration around Hicksville. You had sidings both to the east and west of the station on the main line and on the beginning of the Port Jefferson branch, which splits off just east of the Hicksville station. In 1958, Long Island opened a new yard in the area to serve a lot of the freight business. A lot of this business actually had grown up in the post-war years, so they were fairly modern plants out there that were serviced by the railroad. Another area with a lot of freight activity was Farmingdale. Much of the business was located in the Price Industrial Park, and today that's also retail, or I think that's more big box retail. And they were serviced out of a small yard off the New Highway in East Farmingdale. And when I worked out there in the summer of '74, they still had two shifts operating to drill the different sidings. Here's a train in the new street yard and one of the road freights that would drop cars here in East Farmingdale. Pioneer was another important location. We had Pilgrim State Hospital here and several other customers. Now it's an important yard for the New York and Atlantic Railroad. They originate short freights that go east, both east and west of the yard. They connect with the road freights that come out of Fresh Pond. Out in Riverhead, there were 16 sidings, 16 tracks as recently as 1966. Riverhead handled a lot of potato and cauliflower traffic. During the harvest season, most of these good produce moved by rail. Sometimes you could get as many as 100 cars on the westbound freight train, but it was seasonal business, so it wasn't a very long season that they had all this traffic. And that eventually went over to the trucks, and many of the farms got out of the potato and cauliflower business. Some of them became vineyards, some of them were sold for development. Here you can see some of the refrigerator cars for the potatoes being iced. And here you can see cars being loaded on the team tracks. That's the Riverhead Station in the background. And that yard today is used to store historic Long Island Railroad rolling stock that's owned by a few museums and historical societies in the area, including the Oyster Bay Museum has a couple of cars there as well. On the Oyster Bay branch, there was a neighborhood section, Mineola, called the Hole. It was bounded by the Long Island Railroad to the west, Roslyn Road to the east, and Jericho Turnpike to the south. There were a dozen customers in there, so they were always getting switched. And further up in Roslyn, there were 6 online customers, including Helena Rubinstein, the big cosmetics firm, There were also team tracks, passing siding, and a freight station there. So that was a busy spot too. Oops. Come on, cursor, where'd you go? Where'd you go? Oops, let's go back. Okay, on the Port Jefferson branch, there used to be a little station called Landia at the Robbins Lane grade crossing just south of Syosset. There was a factory there called Circle Wire, later became Cero Wire, and they've been in the news for many years because after they closed, it was a brownfield, and there were always plans to develop the site, but nothing ever came of it. Now they're talking about putting an Amazon warehouse on the location. And you also had a cluster of customers in Huntington. There were 10 at one time, plus 3 team tracks. Now there's only one active customer on the entire branch, and that's Cleat Lumber. There were little branches that came off the Port Jefferson line at both Northport and Kings Park. One time, the Northport line went all the way down to the waterfront. It was cut back over years. The last customer was Axon Lumber, which was just north of Route 25A. And they quit in 1978. And a few years later, that branch was taken up. Out of Kings Park, there was a branch that ran down to the state hospital. It was used for freight, mainly delivery of coal for the power plant, and passengers on the weekend. Family and friends of the patients would come out by train from New York City. That line stayed in until 1987, and I think that's when Kings Park Hospital closed. Gardner Mitchell Secondary was part of what was known as the Central Railroad, which ran between Flushing and Babylon. It's a short section that connects up with what's now the Hempstead line in Garden City. It ends at Endo Boulevard, which is a little bit west of the Meadowbrook Parkway. It also had a small branch that went off over the Meadowbrook Parkway to serve a handful of industries in that area. Their big customers included A&P, Wallbounds, Mitchell Air Force Base until they closed, and Newsday when they still had their operation off on Stewart Avenue. The old Garden City Mineola yard was moved there in around 1970. There's no longer any freight traffic on the line. However, they still use it for work trains, and it's seen a pickup in activity due to the third rail project underway now. People knew it also for hosting the Ringling Brothers circus train when it came to Nassau Coliseum. Here you can see that the layout of the tracks in the Mineola, the Garden City Mitchell Secondary. We'll blow that up. And here's one of the freights crossing the Meadowbrook Parkway, the freight yard up here, and another freight train running along the line. Another piece of the central branch that survived is the Babylon extension between Bethpage Junction and just west of the Babylon station. And in the area between Route 110 and Wellwood Avenue, it had a concentration of customers, and there's still some freight activity over there now. On the Long Beach branch, you had the E.F. Barrett Power Plant, which was built by Long Island Lighting. It opened in 1955, added a second unit in 1963. It was coal-fired, so they depended on uh, cold shipments. They had a yard for storing the hopper cars that could hold 125 cars. They had their own small locomotive to move the cars over to the conveyor, which happens to still be standing. And that locomotive was acquired by the Long Island when Wilco shifted from coal to oil and gas in 1970. It became Long Island 397, and now it's part of the collection of the Oyster Bay Railroad Museum. You can see it in our display yard. It was a busy move. The trains came through 2 to 3 times a week. They could be anywhere from 20 to 60 cars, pulled by anywhere from 2 to 4 locomotives. The West Hempstead branch had customers in the vicinity of Valley Stream. Some of them were served from the viaduct that runs from the Babylon line to just past Merrick Road. And also you had an active yard in West Hempstead. There were several team tracks there and a few other sidings. At one time, the line continued up to Mineola via the Hempstead branch at Country Life Press. There was a passenger loop train that would come out to Mineola, go down to Valley Stream via West Hempstead, and come back to Jamaica and New York. Service on the Hempstead extension ended in 1960. Here, I'll blow up the West Hempstead yard for you. It's the team tracks and the freight station over here, some of the sidings. And on the Montauk branch, you had a lot of freight activity out in Amityville and Bayshore. Patchogue was a big freight center because they had the only deepwater harbor on the south shore of Suffolk County. And going back to the early 20th century, there was a yard there. They had a turntable. They had a dozen customers. They had their own sidings. Best known was the Patchogue Lace Mill, which received coal for the power plant and raw materials and shipped finished goods. The lace mill is north of Montauk Highway, so to serve it, the crews would have to flag traffic on Montauk Highway to get across. Bridgehampton, the most freight traffic for all the Hamptons. 1966, they still had 8 customers. There were 3 team tracks there. And also they were big in originating sand shipments, locally mined sand. There were still a few quarries out that way. In the 19th century, companies started opening fish meal and fish oil processing plants in the area along Napiog Bay between Amagansett and Montauk. And the area got its name, was given to it by the former slaves who were recruited to come up from the south to work at the plant. It was kind of a joke that they had because they didn't think this was the promised land. It was a very smelly, dirty operation. The last of these plants, Atlantic Processing, stayed in until 1968. And go out to Montauk. There was some activity on a former Navy site that became Republic Aerojet. Their sidings had capacity for 70 cars, but I don't think Republic ever used that many. I think they used the yard to switch the Montauk freights when they came in. Long Island handled a variety of products. As I mentioned before, the traffic was overwhelmingly coming to Long Island, going east. Relatively small number of cars originated to go west. They handled a lot of lumber and coal, which I alluded to before, as well as cement and fresh meat. And they shipped out canned goods, potatoes, iron and steel products, and petroleum products. Many big companies had operations on the Long Island. You could see beverage companies like Anheuser-Busch and Canada Dry, big retailers like Macy's and Sears, grocery stores, A&P and Walbaum's, food manufacturers, Ronzoni, Heinz. So it was a good mix of companies that used the railroad. What happened? Between 1950 and 1977, 27 years, half the business was lost. And then in the following 19 years, about 75% of what remained was lost. It fell first from 94,000 to 47,000 and then to less than 12,000. As you can see in this picture at the right, the freight trains were getting shorter and less frequent. Number of reasons for the decline. First, there was competition from trucks. Better roads and new bridges were built, such as the Throgs Neck and the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. There was a big shift underway from coal to oil for home heating and power generation. The construction boom, suburban build out came to a close. Manufacturing declined. A lot of factories closed, not just on Long Island, but throughout the Northeast. The MTA was more interested in its commuter business for obvious reasons. Freight doesn't vote. And service deteriorated as they ran less trains. You could have cars held up for several days. And also the mergers of the Penn Central and Conrail, that didn't help the situation because you no longer had cars coming directly across on the car floats. They had to be routed up to Selkirk and then back down on the east side of the Hudson River. So in 1997, the Long Island threw in the towel on freight. A new company, New York and Atlantic, received a franchise to operate the freight business. They set up their operations in Fresh Pond Yard. Their first year, they didn't do too well, a little over 9,000 cars, but by 2018, they had more than tripled that. They work with around 80 customers today, handle a diverse range of products, and they interchange with CSX in Providence and Worcester, Norfolk Southern in New York and New Jersey, and the Brookhaven Rail Terminal out in Yaphank, which is a transload and logistics center. It opened in 2011. It also provides warehousing and distribution services, truck rail transfer. It's a sizable operation. They have 2.5 miles of track, which means they can easily accommodate more than 100 cars. They're in a good location right off the Long Island Expressway. Their biggest commodities are agriculture, building materials, consumer products, and foods. And they did in 2019 approximately 3,800 cars, which represents more than 10% of New York and Atlantic's entire business. Some parting thoughts. The Long Island Railroad Freight played an important role in developing Long Island and the industrial base in Brooklyn and Queens. It was a complex situation with many operating constraints, a lot of switching going on, a lot of short runs. Its decline resulted from many factors. You can't point to one factor or another. And the good news is that the freight business is rebounding on Long Island in the hands of new operators, the New York Atlantic and Brookhaven terminal. So that's it. I'll get the sharing closed back. just want to acknowledge the sources of material that I work from. Dozens of people's photography is in the presentation. A lot of information from the Trains Are Fun website run by Steve Lynch, and Arts Archive run by Art Hunnicky. And want to single out a gentleman named Robert Emery, who's no longer with us, but in the 1950s and 1960s, he created the detailed maps of the different areas showing the locations of the tracks and buildings. And they are a fabulous resource too. So I thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something.